The patrolman who spat on him had been on the force for some time. He had several excessive force complaints buried in a filing cabinet that nobody with authority had ever bothered to open. He had a union representative who answered his calls before the second ring, and a lieutenant who had spent years making his problems disappear like smoke. He had spent every one of those years operating on a single load-bearing assumption, that the badge on his chest made him the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. He was right about almost everything. He had no idea that the man he was about to spit on, the quiet, older black man in the worn Howard University hoodie sitting on the bench near window 4, was going to be sitting behind the chief's desk of his own department before long. Stay with this one, because what happens in the next hour is not just the end of a career. It is the beginning of a reckoning that is going to dismantle an entire culture of impunity from the inside out, brick by brick, file by file, name by name. And it starts with a morning that was supposed to be nobody's business but his own. Desmond Ellington Webb was in his later years, and he had not set an alarm. This was, in the full context of his life, an almost revolutionary act. After many years with the Chicago Police Department, from his first patrol shift in the 8th District, through years of detective work, through commanding a homicide unit, through his eventual appointment to deputy superintendent, the alarm had been the first word of every morning, a non-negotiable summons from the world of professional obligation into which he had poured the better part of his adult existence. Disabling it the night before had required a small but deliberate act of will, the kind of small, deliberate act of will sometimes required to override deeply grooved habits. He woke naturally, lay still for several minutes, and listened to the city outside his window in the particular way you can only listen when you are not already moving toward the next thing. The sky was doing that specific pre-dawn thing, the gray-purple that belongs only to the half hour before sunrise, that uncertain light that looks like the world considering whether to continue. He had seen this light countless times from the other side of a windshield, driving toward crime scenes and depositions and briefings that began before the precinct coffee had finished brewing. Watching it now from a horizontal position, from the warmth of his own bed in a city he was still learning the rhythms of, felt like a form of wealth he had not previously possessed. He had retired from Chicago sometime earlier, not because he was finished, which he was not, but because a specific chapter of work had reached its natural endpoint, and because a different kind of work had found him before he had a chance to understand what rest felt like. Mayor Evelyn Owens of Hargrove City had called him directly through channels that bypassed the normal political machinery because she did not trust the normal political machinery to produce the chief she needed. She needed someone who had spent a career studying how police departments failed. She needed someone who knew from the inside how misconduct was concealed, who had enough distance from Hargrove's existing culture to cut through it without flinching, and who was, in her exact phrasing during their second phone conversation, too old to care about being liked and too experienced to be played. He had accepted after a period of consideration and one very honest conversation with himself. His official start date was soon. Today was his. He dressed without ceremony, dark jeans worn soft from hundreds of washings, a Howard University hoodie he had bought at his nephew's graduation years earlier and worn so many times the cuffs had frayed to a comfortable softness that no new garment could replicate. Work boots scuffed. He looked at himself in the hallway mirror and saw what anyone would see. An older black man in comfortable, lived-in clothes, unremarkable, going about his morning. He saw the absence of the uniform, the absence of the badge, the version of himself that existed when no one was watching who he professionally was. He had one errand. His younger brother Wendell had died sometime earlier from a heart attack, sudden and merciless and without warning. Wendell had lived in Hargrove for the last years of his life. He had worked as a construction foreman, coached youth basketball on Ellison Street, and had been in the habit of carrying too many things in his truck at all times, a habit that had resulted in a storage locker at the Hargrove City Police Department after his truck was impounded for a registration lapse sometime before he died. The locker had sat there through the grief and the estate complications and the simple, overwhelming business of losing someone without preparation. Desmond had finally secured authorization to collect the contents. He had the paperwork in a sealed envelope in his jacket pocket. He had the address memorized. He would go and collect his brother's things and be home by midday. He drank his coffee at the kitchen table and watched the street wake up. A woman walked a dog. A garbage truck made its rounds. An ordinary morning proceeding with complete indifference to the fact that soon Desmond Webb would walk into a building and assume command of an entire police department. He appreciated the indifference. He finished his coffee and picked up his keys. He did not know as he locked the front door behind him what the morning was actually going to cost. The Hargrove City Police Department occupied a corner building on Meridian Avenue that had been constructed in the 1970s and renovated twice since, neither renovation having done enough to erase the original structure's institutional grimness. The exterior was brick and poured concrete, imposing and tired simultaneously, the way government buildings look when they have been asked to serve more functions than they were designed for. The American flag above the entrance hung stiff in the cold morning air. The steel letters of the department's name were fixed to the facade, several of them slightly misaligned in a way that had long since stopped being noticed by anyone who worked there. Desmond parked in the visitor lot and sat for a moment before getting out. He had been to this building twice before, once for a walkthrough, once for a brief meeting with the outgoing chief, a man named Farwell who had communicated through polite words and unmistakable body language that he believed the department was fundamentally sound and would benefit primarily from being left alone. Desmond had drawn his own conclusions from that meeting and from the departmental review that preceded it. He had kept those conclusions to himself. He was not here in any official capacity today. Mayor Owens's office had offered an escort. He had declined. He wanted to see the building the way a citizen saw it, from the front, alone, without warning. He told himself this was professional instinct. Mostly it was simpler than that. He was here for Wendell's things. That was the whole of it. The lobby of the Hargrove City Police Department communicated everything essential about an institution within the first moments of entry. The ceilings were low, the lighting was fluorescent and too yellow. The floor was linoleum scrubbed so many times the pattern had faded to a ghost of itself in the high-traffic paths from door to counter. A long service desk ran the length of the far wall, divided into 4 numbered windows. A row of plastic chairs, the kind bolted together in groups of 3, formed a waiting area already largely full. The bulletin board near the door held flyers in varying states of age. The American flag on the counter behind window 1 was tilted, knocked over at some point, and replaced without being straightened. The people in the lobby were the particular cross-section that police station lobbies always hold. A grandmother with a spiral notepad, 2 men in construction clothes probably there about a toe, a woman with a child who had the exhausted expression of someone who had been waiting long and expected to wait longer. Everyone processing their own piece of ordinary hardship. Everyone patient in the specific way of people who have no alternative. Desmond found the waiting bench near window 4, the property storage window marked by a small placard on the wall above it. Window 4's light was off, the clerk not yet at their post. He sat down, rested his forearms on his knees, and settled into the patient stillness that decades of police work had built into his constitution. He had learned very early that the ability to wait without agitation was one of the most practically useful qualities a person could possess. He watched the room the way he always watched rooms, without appearing to. He watched how staff at the active windows handled the people in front of them, some efficiently and with reasonable courtesy, some with the flat impatience of people who had been performing the same task for too long and had stopped seeing the individuals before them as individuals. He watched who was given the benefit of the doubt and who was not, how long each transaction took, whether the length appeared to correlate with the complexity of the business or with something else less easily named. He had been sitting for a short while when he became aware of Officer Vance Pruitt. Vance Pruitt was wide through the shoulders, with the build of a man who took the gym seriously and directed considerable personal anger into the effort. His buzz cut was precisely maintained. His uniform was immaculate in the way that reveals personal investment. Every crease sharp, every button aligned, his boots polished to a reflective shine. He carried a large insulated coffee thermos in his left hand with a casual possessiveness, the way some men carry a tool they consider an extension of themselves. He had a habit, Desmond noted immediately, of cracking the knuckles of his right hand against his left palm, not nervously but rhythmically, like a man tapping out a pattern only he could hear. Vance moved through the lobby the way a man moves through space he considers his territory. His gaze moved over the room in a continuous low-level sweep that was neither warm nor curious. It was proprietary, the specific surveillance of someone cataloging potential problems. When his eyes landed on Desmond, sitting quietly on the bench near window 4, older black man in a worn hoodie and work boots, they paused. Desmond met the look without expression and without looking away. He completed his assessment of Vance in approximately 2 seconds and registered the result without allowing it to reach his face. He had a lifetime of practice at this particular calculation. Vance looked away first. He continued his circuit of the lobby, stopped at the service counter to exchange a word with the officer at window 2 in a tone too low to carry, then turned and stood near the entrance with his thermos and his rhythmic knuckle cracking, watching the room. Shortly after, he started walking toward Desmond. Desmond watched him come and thought about Wendell. He thought about the box of Wendell's things sitting in a storage locker somewhere in this building. The small, accumulated physical remnants of a man's daily life, waiting in the dark. He thought about what Wendell would have said about this particular moment because Wendell had always been the one between them who could find the humor in indignity, who had a gift for deflating tension with a single well-placed observation. Desmond would have given something significant for his brother's company. Vance stopped in front of him. He cracked his knuckles once. Desmond looked up unhurried. "You need to clear this area." No greeting, no identification, no acknowledgement that the person being addressed had a reason for existing in a public building on a morning. Just a flat declaration delivered with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having their statements accepted as conclusions, rather than openings for conversation. Desmond did not move. He said in the naturally deep voice that had spent decades learning to carry authority without raising its volume, "I'm waiting for the property clerk at window 4. I have business there." Something shifted in Vance's face. A slight tightening at the jaw. A fractional narrowing of the eyes. The specific expression of a man who is accustomed to having his first statement end the conversation and who has just encountered a different kind of response. "This area is part of the service queue," Vance said. "No number, no seat." This was not accurate. The bench Desmond occupied was designated by the placard directly above it as a waiting area for property storage and evidence retrieval, a function separate from the general service queue. Desmond had read the placard when he sat down because Desmond Webb read signs. He gestured toward the placard with a slight inclination of his head. "Property storage waiting area," he said. "Window 4 opens at 9. I'm early." Vance glanced at the placard, briefly enough that whether he read it was ambiguous. He looked back at Desmond. Whatever it said, it had not altered his position. "You wait over there." He pointed toward the general waiting area near the entrance. "Move." Desmond looked at the general waiting area. He looked at Officer Pruitt. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced the sealed envelope, the physical evidence of legitimate business to conduct at this specific window. He held it up simply, not as a weapon or a demonstration, but as the most straightforward possible evidence of his purpose. "I have an authorization letter for property retrieval," Desmond said. "I have the reference number. The window opens at 9. He checked his watch. "It is almost 9. I will wait here." He placed the envelope on his knee and settled back against the bench with the particular stillness of a man who has decided not to be moved. Something hardened in Vance's face. He had come over here expecting a certain kind of interaction and was encountering a different kind, and the difference itself was registering as a challenge to something he considered essential about the natural order of things in this lobby. He cracked his knuckles against his palm once, twice, and leaned forward, reducing the physical distance between himself and Desmond in a way that was calculated to communicate something about power and space. "People like you," Vance said, and the phrase arrived with the specific weight of something being deployed rather than simply said, "always think you've got a reason to be wherever you are." He let it hang in the air for a beat. "Move to the other area or I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." Desmond looked at him steadily. "If you have a concern about my presence, I'd ask you to bring your supervisor over. I'll explain my business to them." Vance's jaw tightened. The request for a supervisor meant documentation. It meant another person whose account of this interaction would exist. He reached to his shoulder radio. "This is Pruitt in the lobby. I need Calloway up front." The response crackled back shortly. While they waited, the lobby continued around them. The queue moved. A phone rang at the service counter. A child's voice asked when they were going home. Desmond was aware of the people in the waiting area turning their attention toward this exchange with the peripheral attentiveness that public confrontations command even from people who are trying to mind their own business. He was also aware with professional precision that this was a moment with a specific trajectory, that Vance had made a decision before he walked over, and that the envelope, the placard, the accurate information were not going to alter it. The decision had been made from across the room before a single word was exchanged, based on information that had nothing to do with bench designations. Officer Nolan Calloway arrived shortly after. He was young, with a face that still registered the situations it encountered, rather than having learned to process them behind professional glass. He took in the tableau, Vance standing over the seated man, the man calm and unhurried, and his eyes moved between them with something that was not quite uncertainty and not quite concern, but lived in the territory between. "Calloway," Vance said, "stand by." Non-compliant individual refusing to vacate. Calloway looked at Desmond, looked at the bench placard, looked back at Vance. He said nothing, which communicated something. Desmond looked at Calloway and said clearly and without urgency, "Officer, I have an authorization letter for property retrieval at window 4. I am waiting for the clerk. I have not been given any reason in law for this request to move, and I am respectfully declining until I receive one." Calloway's expression shifted in a way that suggested he understood this to be true, and found himself at an uncomfortable intersection between the truth and his partner's authority. The escalation followed the logic of its own internal architecture, which is to say it was not accidental. Vance was a man who had spent his time on the force experiencing the absence of consequences, and the absence of consequences had gradually, completely, and invisibly removed his capacity to calculate them. Each step of what followed was, from inside his specific version of reality, reasonable. He was restoring order. He was doing his job. He had a situation and he was handling it. This was exactly what made men like him dangerous. He stepped closer to Desmond, close enough that the physical geometry of the interaction changed, no longer conversational distance, but the distance of assertion. His shadow fell across Desmond's knees. "Last time," Vance said, his voice dropping in a way that was not accommodation, but intensification. "You want to get up on your own, or you want me to help you?" Desmond did not move. He felt Vance's physical proximity as the fact it was, the activation of deep biological alertness that any person feels when a larger man positions himself with intent. He kept this alertness below the surface. He kept his hands still, his envelope on his knee, his posture unchanged. "I want a supervisor," Desmond said. "That is my answer. I want a supervisor." Around them, the lobby had changed its texture. The ambient noise had thinned. The conversations at the service windows had gone quieter. Several people in the waiting area were looking directly at them. Two had their phones in their hands, screens up, cameras open. Desmond registered this with the peripheral awareness of a man who had been working rooms for decades. He registered it as important. Vance registered the phones too, and something in that registration went wrong in him. Instead of the natural self-correction that witnesses should produce in a professional, the instinctive recalibration, the backing down, it pushed him further. As though being watched confirmed that this was a performance requiring a conclusion. As though retreating now in front of an audience would mean something irreversible about who he was. He reached forward and grabbed Desmond's left arm by the sleeve of his hoodie. Desmond stood up deliberately, not reactively, not pulled, but rising the way a person rises when they choose to. He was taller than Vance by half an inch. He planted his feet. "Remove your hand," Desmond said. "Don't touch him," said a woman somewhere in the waiting area. An involuntary reaction directed at no one specifically, at the air itself. "What is the charge?" Desmond said. His voice was completely level. "What is your probable cause? State it clearly." Vance did not state it clearly. He did not state anything. What happened instead was what happens when a spring wound tight by years of unchecked authority encounters a wall. It cannot move. Not a decision exactly, but a release. Vance's face contracted with a specific kind of rage, the rage of a man who expects capitulation and encounters resistance, and he leaned forward and he spat. It was deliberate, not accidental, not ambiguous, not a consequence of elevated voice or physical exertion. It was targeted, conscious, theatrical. The spit landed on the front of Desmond's Howard University hoodie, on the left side above the Bison logo, dark and unmistakable against the heather gray fabric. The lobby went silent, not gradually, instantaneously. The specific silence that happens when something occurs far enough outside the bounds of expected human behavior that everyone present requires a full beat to confirm what they have witnessed. 2 full seconds in which the only sounds were the fluorescent lights humming and the distant crackle of a police radio somewhere down the hall. Officer Calloway made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite anything else. Desmond looked down at his hoodie. He looked at what was on it, looked at it with the specific clinical attention of a man assessing damage rather than reacting to it. He looked at it for a long moment, then he raised his eyes to Vance's face. What his expression showed in that moment would be described differently by every person in the lobby who witnessed it. Some would say he looked angry. Some would say he looked sad. Some would say he looked like a man who had just had something confirmed about the world that he already knew it had, in some compartment of himself, hoped to be wrong about. One person, a woman near the service counter who would later give a written statement, described it as the face of a man who had just won something he never wanted to win. That was perhaps the most precise description. It was the face of complete, devastating calm. The calm of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how moments like this one work, who understood their mechanics from the inside, who knew their documentation requirements and their evidentiary value and their ultimate trajectory. It was the face of a prosecutor looking at the critical piece of evidence that had just walked itself into the record. Vance stared at Desmond and waited. He waited for the eruption, for the shout, the physical response, the display of anger that would give him what he needed, the justification, the suspect, the narrative. He waited for a man to become manageable. Desmond looked at him with the cold patience of someone who has been waiting for a different outcome than the one the other person is expecting. "I want you to remember," Desmond said very quietly, "exactly what you just did." Vance had passed the point where rational navigation was available to him. He had done something irrevocable in front of at least a dozen witnesses and several phone cameras. And the rational response was to stop, to step back, to call the supervisor Desmond had been requesting since the beginning. The rational response was to minimize the damage, but the rational response required acknowledging that damage had been done, and Vance had spent his time on the force operating without meaningful correction, which had made acknowledging damage something he was structurally unable to do. He had submitted completely to the internal logic of the situation he had created, and the logic of that situation required a conclusion. "Disorderly conduct," Vance said, his voice tight with the specific tightness of a man constructing a narrative in real time. "Failure to comply. Hands behind your back." "I have not committed disorderly conduct," Desmond said. "I have not been given a lawful direction with a legal basis. I am requesting a supervisor. I am noting for the record," he said this slightly louder, directed at the room, at the phones, at the record being made in real time, "that I have requested a supervisor multiple times and been denied." Several people in the lobby had their phones raised, now open and unambiguous, recording. The woman who had spoken earlier had stepped back to get a better angle. The man beside her had not moved, but had stopped pretending to look at his own paperwork. Vance grabbed Desmond's right arm. Calloway, after a moment that was visibly uncomfortable, a moment in which he made a decision that he would spend months reconsidering, moved to Desmond's left. Desmond did not resist. He would make this point later in writing, under oath and detail corroborated by every piece of video footage and every witness account. He did not resist. He went with them the way experienced people in his position go with this kind of force, by choice because the alternative creates danger, and because compliance in the moment does not mean acceptance of what is happening. It means survival. It means the preservation of the ability to address it correctly afterward. His arms were pulled behind his back. The handcuffs clicked, the steel biting into the thin skin of his wrists, too tight the way cuffs go when applied quickly and without care. He absorbed the discomfort without showing it. The sealed envelope was taken from his hand, his wallet, his keys. Vance escorted him by the arm toward the lobby exit, toward the exterior, toward the vehicle bay. Desmond walked. He let himself be walked. The lobby watched every step. The automatic doors opened and the cold morning air hit him, cutting through the hoodie that now had a man's spit drying on the front of it. His truck sat in the visitor lot some distance away, ordinary private belonging to the part of his life that existed outside this moment. He looked at it briefly, noted its location with the same professional habit with which he noted everything, and then looked forward. Vance shoved him into the back of the transport car. Desmond's shoulder took the impact against the plastic partition. He absorbed this too. He slid across the hard seat, found a position, and was still. The car smelled of industrial cleaner and accumulated human stress. The plastic partition offered a warped view of the front. His hands were cuffed behind him in the specific discomfort that he had read described in 100 incident reports, but had not personally experienced from this angle before. He adjusted, found the least bad configuration, and directed his attention inward. He began to catalog. It was not a conscious decision. It was what his mind did automatically in situations requiring documentation. 1. False arrest without probable cause. 2. Excessive force resulting in physical injury. His wrists, his shoulder, the marks that were already forming. 3. Racially charged language. People like you, delivered with the specific deliberateness of a weapon. 4. Failure to honor multiple explicit requests for a supervisor. 5. The act of deliberate bodily contact. Biological material intentionally deposited on a person in custody, which had a legal classification that the person who had done it had apparently not paused to consider. He thought about that for a moment. The legal classification. He knew exactly what it was. Through the partition, he heard Vance get in, heard the door, heard Calloway in the passenger seat. The engine turned over. The car pulled out of the bay and onto Cross Street. "Lot of nerve," Vance said from the front. He was talking at Desmond through the partition in the way people talk at someone restrained and cannot effectively respond, the specific dynamic of performed authority over a captive audience. Hanging around a police station acting like you own the place. Always got something to say. Always got to make everything complicated. Desmond watched the building recede through the rear window. He thought about Wendell. He thought about Wendell's laugh, the loudest, most unself-conscious laugh he had ever encountered on a human being, the kind that made people start laughing before they knew the joke. He thought about the box of Wendell's things in the storage locker, which was still in that building, which would continue to be there until someone with proper authorization came to collect it. He thought about how Wendell had lived in this city for years and had deserved to be served by this department rather than managed by it. He said through the partition without raising his voice, "What is your employee number, Officer Pruitt?" A short, contemptuous laugh from the front. "Read it off the badge when you're processed." "I'd like you to state it verbally," Desmond said, "for my own record." "You don't have a record. You're in custody." "I have a memory," Desmond said. A brief silence, then, "You know what? I've dealt with 100 guys like you, all attitude. Let's see how much you've got to say sitting and holding." Desmond looked at this passing street and continued to catalog. He noted the route, the time confirmed by the clock on a bank sign through the window, the cruiser's rear identifier number, the radio codes Vance was using to communicate with dispatch. He noted Calloway's silence in the passenger seat, which was the silence of a young man processing what he had witnessed and had not yet decided what to do with it. That silence was its own form of information. He let some time pass. Then he said quietly, in the flat, factual tone of a man making a simple observation about conditions, "I would remember this drive if I were you, Officer Pruitt." Vance did not respond. Calloway did not respond. The car arrived at the rear bay sometime later. Desmond had the route memorized, the time logged, the badge number noted, and the names of 2 witnesses from the lobby who had made the specific kind of eye contact that communicates solidarity and the intention to remember. He had everything he needed. The bay door rolled down behind them. The engine cut, and Desmond sat in the hard plastic seat, in the handcuffs, in the hoodie with Vance's spit drying on it, and he was entirely still, and he was already thinking about his first day on the job. The booking area was on the ground floor, accessible from the rear vehicle bay through heavy steel doors. It was rectangular, fluorescent, windowless, the kind of room where everything looks slightly more stark than it would anywhere else, where the lighting is bright enough to compensate for the absence of natural light in a way that creates not warmth but clinical flatness. A row of holding cells occupied the far wall behind reinforced steel mesh. The elevated booking desk dominated the near end, presiding over the room the way these desks are designed to preside, from above, looking down. At the booking desk sat Sergeant Marlene Cross. Marlene Cross had been with the Hargrove City Police Department for many years. She had started on patrol, moved to administrative and booking roles after a knee injury, and had maintained across the full span of her tenure a paperwork error rate of essentially 0, a fact she considered her most important professional credential. She was with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck that she lifted to her face only when absolutely necessary, which she considered a matter of personal principle. She was currently doing a crossword puzzle, which she folded to the back page without urgency when she heard the bay doors. Vance came through with Desmond. He had the air of a man presenting something he had retrieved. "Got a non-compliant from the lobby," he said, pushing Desmond toward the holding wall. "Disorderly, failure to comply. Run him for priors and let's get this moving." Marlene looked at Desmond. She did this in the flat evaluating way of a person for whom every intake was functionally identical until the paperwork proved otherwise. She noted the Howard University hoodie. She noted the handcuffs. She noted the sealed envelope in Vance's left hand, carried loose, which was not correct procedure. Confiscated properties should have been bagged and tagged before entering the booking area. She reached for her intake form. "All right," she said. "Let's get a name. Turn around, sir." Desmond turned. The fluorescent light of the booking area hit his face directly, full, unobstructed, designed to see everything clearly. Marlene Cross looked at his face. She reached for her reading glasses and put them on. She looked at his face again. Her pen stopped. It was suspended motionless above the form. Her expression underwent a series of changes that happened in such rapid succession they were almost simultaneous. Recognition. First, the widening of the eyes that happens when the brain receives information that contradicts its expectations. Then the rapid internal process of reconciling what the eyes were showing with where the eyes were showing it and under what circumstances. Then something with a specific gravity to it, the gravity of a person who suddenly understands the full dimensions of a situation rather than just its surface. She had seen this face before, not casually, not in passing. She had seen it in the specific context of official business that makes a face important and memorable. Sometime earlier, in the course of her normal administrative duties, she had processed a routing memo from the mayor's office, one of many documents that crossed her desk. The memo had contained, in the section labeled Appointment Summary, a name and a formal headshot photograph. The photograph had been a good likeness. She was looking at that face right now, in her booking area, in handcuffs. The pen slipped from her fingers. It hit the elevated desk with a sharp, small crack that in the quiet of the booking area was startlingly loud. It rolled to the edge. It dropped to the floor behind the counter with a second softer sound. Marlene did not move to retrieve it. She was very still. "Desmond Ellington Webb," she whispered. The name came out like a prayer and a confession pressed together into a single breath, like a woman confirming a disaster she has been hoping to be wrong about and has just confirmed she is not. Vance, leaning against the far wall finishing his coffee, turned at the sound of the dropped pen. He frowned. He had not registered the whisper clearly. "What's the holdup, Marlene?" "Run him for priors." Marlene Cross did not look at Vance. She looked at Desmond. She looked at him with the expression of a person holding something large and fragile and understanding that she cannot hold it alone. "Officer Pruitt," she said. Her voice had stripped itself to its essential frequency, not raised, not hysterical, but carrying the specific quality of urgency that strips away all professional decoration and communicates its meaning directly. Come here right now." Vance walked over with the mild irritation of a man being interrupted during a task he considers already complete. He looked at the intake screen, which Marlene had pulled up before he arrived, the department's integrated personnel and command directory, which included not just current personnel, but all authorized individuals with clearances and incoming appointments. She had typed the name. The screen had populated. He read it. His eyes moved across the profile from left to right. They reached the photograph, the formal headshot against the plain background, and they stopped. He looked at the photograph, and then he looked at Desmond standing a short distance away in the handcuffs. He looked at the photograph again. He read the title beneath it. He read the effective date. He read it twice. The smirk, that permanent, habitual, proprietary smirk that had been as much a part of his face as his bone structure, did not fade gradually. It was there and then it was gone, as completely and instantaneously as a light switched off. What replaced it was not fear, not anger, not any single identifiable emotion, but the total absence of them, a blank stricken quality, the specific expression of a person whose operating system has received input, it cannot process, and has not yet loaded a response. The screen said Desmond Ellington Webb, Deputy Superintendent Retired, Chicago Police Department. Appointed Chief of Police, Hargrove City Police Department. Effective soon. Two officers working at desks across the room had been watching since Marlene stood up. They read the screen from where they were sitting. One made a short involuntary sound. The other went completely still, a stillness of a different quality than inattention. Desmond stood in the center of the room in the handcuffs, in his Howard University hoodie with Vance's spit on it. And he was quiet. He was not performing composure. He simply possessed it the way he had possessed it in the lobby and in the transport car and on every morning of a career built on the ability to be the most patient person in any given situation. He looked at Vance with an expression that contained no triumph, no vindication, nothing that could be named as satisfaction. It contained instead the completion of a calculation, the specific expression of a person who has correctly anticipated every step of a process and is now watching the final step execute exactly as predicted. Vance's right hand moved, the habitual tick activated before he was aware of it, knuckles finding palm, the familiar rhythm. And then he realized what he was doing and stopped. He forced his hands to his sides. He stood with them there motionless, and the stillness of his hands was its own precise announcement about what was happening inside him. Moments passed. The booking area was entirely silent. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the building a phone rang unanswered. Then Vance opened his mouth. The first thing that came out was not words, but the specific sound of a man attempting to locate a version of reality in which he is not ruined. "Sarge," he said. His voice was a full octave higher than normal. "Sarge, the manager called. "She said he was concealing merchandise. She said Officer Pruitt." Marlene's voice came down on his like a door closing. "Stop talking." She was already around the booking desk, moving toward Desmond with her keys in her hand, moving with the specific speed of a person executing damage control, not running but moving with the purposeful pace of someone for whom every second of delay is a second of additional institutional catastrophe. She reached Desmond and looked up at him with the expression of a person who is, beneath the professional surface, genuinely horrified, and is also a professional and is therefore managing both of these things simultaneously. "I am so sorry," she said, and her voice carried in those 4 words more sincerity than most people manage in a paragraph. "I am removing the restraints right now." She found the key. Her hands were steady. Marlene Cross had been processing difficult intakes for many years, and her hands had learned to stay steady when the rest of her was not. She inserted the key. The cuffs opened. She caught them before they fell and held them at her side. Desmond brought his arms forward slowly. He looked at his wrists, the red indentations pressed into the skin, the marks that were already settling toward bruise. He looked at them with the same clinical attention with which he had looked at the spit on his hoodie, assessing, filing, making the record complete. Then he looked at Vance. Vance was standing at the terminal, back slightly against the wall behind it, and he looked like a man who has discovered too late the nature of the thing he has been standing on. His face had gone from blank to a grayish, unhealthy pallor that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lighting. His mouth was opening and closing in the specific way of a person cycling through possible statements and finding none of them survivable. His eyes moved from Desmond to the screen to Marlene to Desmond again, searching for something, an ally, an exit, a version of events that closed differently than the one currently unfolding. He found none of these things. He cracked his knuckles once involuntarily, then stopped himself again, and the stopping of himself again communicated everything that needed to be communicated about his psychological state. The 2 officers who had been at their desks were not at their desks anymore. They were standing, watching. The intake assistant near the filing cabinets had not moved, but had entirely stopped pretending to do anything else. The room had the quality of a held breath, of many people simultaneously understanding something significant and waiting for the person who is going to name it to name it. Desmond named it. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room had already organized itself around him in the way that rooms organize themselves around people who carry genuine authority, not the authority of a badge or a rank or a title, but the deeper authority of a person who has spent a career earning the right to be heard. He turned to the door that led to the main corridor, and he said clearly and without hurry, "I need Lieutenant Warren Moss in this room right now." Marlene Cross was already reaching for the phone. While they waited, and the wait was short, because Marlene's call had the specific quality of a call that conveys emergency without explaining it, which produces faster results than specificity, Desmond stood in the center of the booking area and was still. He did not pace. He did not make demands. He did not look at Vance again, except once, a single brief look that was not threatening and not performative. Simply the acknowledgement of a person who is filing one final piece of information before moving to the next stage of the process. Vance sat down on the bench near the holding cell wall. This was the same bench onto which he had shoved Desmond earlier. He sat on it now the way people sit when their legs have become unreliable, and he stared at the floor, and he said nothing. The habitual architecture of his professional self, the swagger, the smirk, the physical presence that had commanded this lobby for some time, had collapsed as completely and as quickly as a structure whose load-bearing wall has been removed. What remained was something much smaller and much more frightening. Lieutenant Warren Moss arrived with the specific energy of a man who has received an alarming call and is expecting something manageable. He was compact with the expression of someone who had spent a long career in successful political navigation and was comfortable with the outcomes this had produced. He had cleared Vance's prior excessive force complaints through internal affairs with documentation techniques that were, depending on your perspective, either careful procedure or deliberate obstruction. He walked in expecting a routine intake problem. He stopped when he saw the screen. He read it. He looked at Desmond, at the spit on the hoodie, at the red marks on his wrists, at the expression of quiet, absolute authority on the face of the man who was going to be his commanding officer before long. He looked like a man who has just realized that the building he has been standing in is not the building he thought it was. Desmond addressed him by name and rank, specifically, precisely, demonstrating that he already knew the chain of command, that he had reviewed the organizational structure before his first official day, that there was no element of this department he had not already begun to understand. "Lieutenant Moss," he said, "my name is Desmond Ellington Webb. I have been unlawfully detained, physically assaulted, and subjected to a deliberate act of degradation by Officer Pruitt in the lobby of this building in front of multiple witnesses and on multiple active recordings. I require 3 things to happen in the next short while. First, all surveillance footage from the lobby, the transport bay, and this booking area from this morning forward is to be secured immediately on an isolated server. No access except to persons I personally designate. If one frame of that footage is missing, corrupted, or modified, I will file a federal obstruction referral personally, and I will file it against you." Moss's mouth opened slightly. Second, Officer Pruitt's body camera and the dash cam from the transport vehicle are to be surrendered to Sergeant Cross within the next short while. He looked at Vance when he said this. Vance did not look up. Third, the sealed authorization letter confiscated from me during my unlawful arrest is to be returned to me immediately. A pause. Then Moss said with the last available reach toward control, "Chief Webb, let me make this right. Let's handle this internally. Let me make some calls and—" "We are done talking," Desmond said. The sentence was 4 words. They arrived with the specific finality of a door closing on a hallway. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the complete elimination of the space that had existed before they were spoken. Moss turned to Vance. He said, "Give me your camera." Vance unclipped his body camera from his chest with hands that were not fully steady. He set it on the booking desk. Desmond retrieved the sealed envelope from the confiscated property bin. He opened it. He removed the official appointment letter. The letter bearing Mayor Evelyn Owens' signature. The letter that had been in his pocket through the entire lobby confrontation, through the transport car, through the booking intake. He placed it flat on the booking desk, face up in the full light where every person in the room could read it. He did not gesture at it. He did not make a production of placing it there. He simply put it down and left it in plain sight, and it said everything a letter of that kind says when it is allowed to speak for itself. Then he looked at Marlene Cross. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said. "You handled a very difficult situation with integrity." Marlene Cross, many-year veteran, person of 0 paperwork errors and absolute professional composure, looked at him and nodded once and then looked very carefully at the ceiling for a moment, which was the only sign she allowed herself of the enormous weight she was carrying in that instant. Desmond took out his phone and made one call. It was still morning. He had been in the building for a short time. By later that morning, while Desmond was at Hargrove General having his wrists examined and the marks photographed as part of the medical record his attorney, Simone Rivers, had advised him to establish, the videos were already moving. There were 3 of them. 3 separate phones, 3 separate angles, all capturing the same short sequence in the lobby. The clearest shot, from a slight elevation with surprisingly steady hands by a woman named Gloria Odom, who had been waiting to report a fender bender, captured everything. The approach, the exchange about the bench, Vance reaching for Desmond's arm, the spit, and in the moments after the spit, Desmond's face looking down at the hoodie, then slowly back up with an expression that the internet would spend the next while attempting to caption and consistently failing, because what was on his face was not captionable. It was the specific expression of a man who has just been handed exactly what he needed and who knows it and who is not going to say so. The audio on Gloria Odom's recording was extremely clear. Every word was audible. By afternoon, the original video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. By evening, it had reached the threshold where platform algorithms amplify without being asked, where national media picks it up independently, where the story enters the broader culture and acquires momentum of its own. The local affiliates ran it that evening. The national networks had it by nightfall. By then, Hargrove Police Department was generating more online search traffic than the city had ever produced in its documented history. Mayor Evelyn Owens held her emergency press conference that evening, and she was the specific version of herself that she brought to moments requiring directness over performance, stripped of the usual rhetorical scaffolding, dealing in facts. She confirmed Desmond's appointment publicly ahead of schedule, and she stated it as a fact rather than a response to the video, which was an important distinction. She was not announcing him because of what had happened. She was confirming an appointment already made, and the video was merely a clarification of why the appointment had been necessary. She said that what had been captured was consistent with the patterns that had made the appointment necessary in the first place. She said the incoming chief would be reviewing those patterns immediately and thoroughly. She said any person who believed the change in leadership would be cosmetic was invited to reconsider. She said all of this in a short time and took 3 questions and left the podium. By nightfall, a journalist named Lena Wells at the Hargrove Tribune had obtained, through a Freedom of Information request filed earlier for an entirely different story, the internal affairs records for all prior excessive force complaints filed against Vance in his time on the force. Several closed without action. One closed with a written reprimand that could not be located in the physical file. All complainants Black or Latino men. Wells ran the piece that night with the full documentation attached. Officer Nolan Calloway had watched the press conference from his apartment alone with a glass of water he had not touched. He had spent the afternoon in a specific kind of internal silence. Not the silence of indecision, but the silence of a person who has already decided something and is waiting for the necessary courage to arrive in sufficient quantity to act on it. He had been on the force for some time. He had come in with specific ideas about what serving the public meant. He had spent that time watching those ideas be tested by a culture operating on different premises. This morning had been the clearest test yet. He had failed it by participating, and he knew it, and he was the kind of person for whom knowing something like that was incompatible with continued inaction. He walked into the Internal Affairs Division that evening alone, unrepresented, carrying a handwritten account of the morning's events that he had been composing since he got home, and he submitted it. He stated everything in the sequence it had occurred without omission, without the protective instinct toward a colleague that his time on the force had not managed to fully install in him. His account confirmed every element of the lobby video and added detail: the radio call, the specific language Vance used in the transport vehicle, the absence of any non-compliance by Desmond at any point in the interaction. He submitted his account and went home and called his mother. Vance, on administrative leave, watched the coverage from his kitchen table. His union representative, Garrett Dugan, called shortly after. The conversation lasted some time. Vance would not describe it in detail to anyone afterward, but the quality of his face when he ended the call communicated its content. A specific draining quality, as though the call had removed something structural that he had been relying on without being fully aware of how heavily. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. For the first time in his time on the force, he could not locate the reliable machinery of his own protection. It was as though he had reached for a tool he kept in a specific place and found the place empty. He sat with this for a long time, and what he felt in sitting with it was a preview of what the coming months were going to feel like. The discovery that the floor he had been standing on was not solid, had never been solid, and that the only reason it had held this long was that no one with sufficient weight had stepped on it. Desmond arrived at the Hargrove City Police Department on his first morning at the expected time. He came through the front entrance, the same automatic doors through which he had been marched in handcuffs days earlier, and he walked through the lobby at the pace of a man going to work. No ceremony, no performance. He was in full uniform, the chief's dress uniform, 4 silver stars on the collar. Every service commendation from his long career in Chicago arranged in proper order across his chest. His shoes were polished to the standard he had maintained every professional morning of his adult life. He carried nothing in his hands. He passed the bench near window 4 without breaking stride, though he was aware of it in his peripheral vision in the way a person is aware of a landmark they have examined carefully before. The lobby staff saw him first, then the people in the waiting area, then the officers near the entrance. The recognition moved through the lobby in a wave. Not everyone immediately, not everyone completely, but enough to change the quality of the room's attention. He went through the security door, up the stairs, into the main administrative corridor. The all-hands briefing was called for shortly after arrival. Officers, detectives, administrative staff, and command personnel filled the main assembly room. Desmond stood at the podium and looked out at them, and the silence before he began speaking had a quality that several people in the room would remember long afterward. Not threatening, not theatrical, but completely inhabiting the space in a way that made everyone present more awake to what they were about to hear. He spoke for some time. He did not raise his voice at any point. He described what had occurred that morning in language that was direct and without embellishment. He said it was not an isolated incident. It was a demonstration of a pattern of conduct that the department had been recruited to address, a pattern made possible by the sustained absence of meaningful oversight. He said it clearly, and he said it once. Then he announced the structural changes, 3 of them effective immediately. The first, an independent civilian oversight board with full subpoena authority over departmental records, body camera footage, use of force reports, internal affairs documentation, with no requirement for chief of police approval to access any of it, to be constituted soon. The second, a mandatory body camera policy, 0 tolerance for. The first call the night of the incident, "We've handled worse than this. Casey, I've seen guys walk away from things that looked worse on camera than this. The union has a substantial war chest and lawyers who do nothing but eat civil rights cases for breakfast. Sit tight, don't talk to anyone. Let me do the work." The second call sometime later, shorter with less certainty in it, more procedure. "The AG's office has made a records request. We're reviewing what they're entitled to. Don't worry, these things take time, and time works in our favor." The third call never came. Instead, there was a letter. The Police Benevolent Association's legal counsel, in language that was careful and bureaucratic, and which conveyed its essential message through what it declined to say rather than what it said directly, informed Vance that the union would not be funding his criminal defense. Vance's conduct had been determined to fall outside the scope of actions the bylaws authorized the union to defend, meaning you are alone. Vance read the letter at his kitchen table. He read it twice. He set it down and sat across from it as though it were a person. He had spent his time on the force understanding himself as protected by the union, by the culture, by Moss, by the institutional momentum of a department that had found him useful and had never meaningfully curtailed him. That protection had always been conditional in theory and absolute in practice, and the gap between the theory and the practice had never seemed important because the practice had always held. He had never been required to understand the actual conditions. He was understanding them now in his kitchen, with a letter on the table and a television in the next room running coverage of his case on the Chiron. The State Attorney General's criminal investigation had opened under Rosalind Whitmore, a longtime AG veteran who specialized in civil rights violations and whose methods were methodical in the way that made defense attorneys genuinely uneasy. She had obtained Vance's full complaint history quickly and had contacted all prior complainants directly. Their agreement to give formal statements was immediate. Their agreement communicated something important about how long they had been waiting for someone with authority to ask. Quentin Briggs pulled over some time earlier for a disputed lane change, fractured wrist, disorderly conduct charge, lost a job interview. Lamar Maddox stopped walking home from a late restaurant shift, accused of loitering, bruising on his neck and arms, photographed and attempted to report complaint logged, and then apparently lost. Derek Harlow, questioned while loading equipment from his van outside a client's house, physical contact that aggravated a prior back injury, multiple chiropractic visits. Isaiah Stills stopped while sitting in his car outside a grocery store eating lunch. Vehicle searched without consent or cause. Interior left damaged, dignity taken. None of them had been believed. All of them had been told in various bureaucratic phrasings that the matter had been reviewed and that no violation of department policy had been found. When Rosalind Whitmore called them, she told them that was no longer the finding. Vance's first plea offer arrived at the AG's office on a certain day. Misdemeanor improper conduct, no jail time, forfeiture of employment. Prosecutor Denise Stafford declined it the same day she received it. Vance's second plea offer, submitted sometime later with slight modifications, was declined within the hour. Moss, meanwhile, had received his own accounting. The AG's review of his administrative record had produced a detailed picture of the mechanism through which Vance's complaints had been closed. A consistent pattern of insufficient investigation, improperly documented findings, and in some cases, statements from complainants recorded differently in the official file than they had been delivered in person. Small discrepancies individually, a clear pattern collectively. Moss was looking at obstruction charges, potential perjury, and personal civil liability that his attorney was having difficulty quantifying. He called the AG's office and indicated his willingness to cooperate. His testimony, provided over several sessions, was the backbone of the criminal case. He described the mechanism clearly and in full: who directed the approach, what specific steps were taken to ensure complaints did not advance, what the departmental culture had been regarding officers who generated excessive force complaints, and how that culture was maintained. His account was detailed, internally consistent, corroborated at every point where corroboration was possible. He delivered it in the flat transactional tone of a man meeting the terms of an agreement he has made with full understanding of what the alternative was. The blue wall did not hold. It did not hold because the structural conditions that walls require, shared stakes, distributed exposure, the calculus of mutual protection, had been superseded by a different calculus. When the weight on one side becomes sufficient, the wall does not hold. It simply does not. The trial was short. In the context of a case with this profile, it was startlingly efficient, but efficiency was the appropriate response to a case whose evidentiary foundation left the defense with very little viable territory. Denise Stafford opened on the first morning with the video, all three versions, the wide shot, the close angle, Gloria Odom's recording played in sequence, giving the jury the experience of seeing the same short sequence from three separate physical perspectives, not one viewpoint's interpretation, dimensional understanding. She paused Gloria Odom's recording at the moment of the spit. She left it paused for some time. The courtroom was completely silent. Then she advanced the recording one frame at a time until she reached the image of Desmond's face looking back up from his hoodie. That specific expression, the one that the internet had spent some time failing to caption. She paused it there too. She said, "Ladies and gentlemen, look at his face." She let them look at it for some time. Then she said, "That is a man who has just been handed what he needed. He doesn't know yet what any of you in this room already know. He doesn't know his appointment has been publicly announced. He doesn't know that every phone in that lobby is recording. What he knows is what decades of investigating misconduct has told him. This moment is already in the record, and that is enough." She moved on. On the second day, the prior complainants testified. Stafford had prepared them carefully, not to shape their accounts, which required no shaping, but to ensure they understood the process, that they were comfortable, that the experience of finally being heard did not also have to be an experience of additional difficulty. She questioned them gently and completely. Each account covered the same terrain: the nature of the initial contact with Vance, the absence of legitimate cause, the physical force applied, the injuries or other consequences, and the response when they attempted to report what had happened. The cumulative effect of the accounts with identical structural features, the same profile of target, the same escalation pattern, the same institutional dismissal of the complaint afterward, was not something Curtis Marsh, Vance's defense attorney, could effectively address. He cross-examined each complainant looking for inconsistencies, for useful threads. He did not find them. He sat down after each cross with the expression of a man executing a professional obligation without expectation of result. On the morning of the third day, Stafford played the body camera footage. specifically the audio from the transport vehicle in which Vance's voice was captured making a series of remarks about Desmond during the drive to the booking bay. She played it after she had established for the jury the full context of the moment. Vance alone in the front of the car with a man he has just spat on and arrested on fabricated charges, a man he believes is entirely subject to his power with no means of recourse, a man he does not know is his incoming chief of police. The audio played through the courtroom speakers in the silence of a room paying complete attention. Vance's voice. Always got something to say, always got to make everything complicated. Lot of nerve hanging around a police station acting like you own the place. Then a pause, then, you know what your problem is? You people always think the rules are different for you. They're not. They never are. Stafford paused the recording. The silence in the room was the specific silence that follows the playing of audio in a courtroom when the audio has just clarified everything essential about a case. She said, "You people." She let it sit there for some time. Then she said, "That is the operating consciousness of the man who spat on Desmond Ellington Webb. That is the lens through which Officer Pruitt perceived a man in his later years sitting quietly on a bench with an authorization letter in his hand." She looked at the jury. That phrase, "you people," Bassi, is not the phrase of a man who made a split-second error under stress. It is the phrase of a man describing a category he had been treating one specific way for his time on the force, with the full knowledge and institutional protection of his superiors. The jury deliberated for some time. Guilty on the first count, felony assault under color of law. Guilty on the second count, civil rights deprivation. Guilty on the third count, official misconduct. Vance was at the defense table when the first guilty was read, and he pitched forward onto his elbows in the instinctive motion of a person who suddenly requires external support to remain upright. The second and third guilty verdicts were read into a courtroom that had gone so quiet that the single sound of someone in the gallery quietly crying, not a dramatic sound but a relieved one, was audible from the press section. The sentencing hearing fell on a morning, cold and clear, the kind of winter clarity where the air has a precision to it and colors are sharper than usual. The courtroom was at capacity before the session began. The prior complainants, Quentin Briggs, Lamar Maddox, Derek Harlow, Isaiah Stills, were in the second row when Desmond arrived. He took a seat in the gallery in civilian clothes as a private citizen. Simone Rivers sat beside him. He was still in the way. He was always still. Not passive, but contained, the stillness of a person who has directed enormous force with perfect economy of movement and is now simply present for what comes next. Judge Elaine Marsh took the bench. She was silver-haired with the quality of presence that comes from years of presiding over difficult cases with absolute attention and absolute commitment to the process she served. She called the court to order and invited the victim impact statement. Desmond walked to the podium. He adjusted the microphone. He looked at the room, the gallery, the press, the four men in the second row. Vance at the defense table in County Orange with his hands folded and his eyes on the table surface. He was quiet for a moment, not to gather himself, but to allow the room to become fully present before he addressed it. He began with 2 sentences about himself. He said he had been physically injured by what Vance had done. His wrists, the marks that had taken some time to fully fade, the violation of being marched through a public space in handcuffs, and that the injuries had healed completely. He said he was grateful for that. He said it simply as a statement of fortunate fact, and then he moved immediately and entirely away from himself. He said the name Quentin Briggs. He said it with the deliberateness of a man saying something that has not been said publicly enough in the specific setting where saying it publicly matters most. He said that Quentin Briggs had trusted this department's process, had told the truth about what happened to him, and had been dismissed. He said the name Lamar Maddox and said the same thing. He said Derek Harlow. He said Isaiah Stills. He said each name and said the same thing specifically and without variation. Because the fact of the repetition was itself the point. The same story, the same response from the department, the same dismissal multiple times over. In the second row, each man's face changed slightly when his name was spoken, not dramatically, in the small private way that faces change when something that was previously held in silence enters the public record. Desmond said, "The system failed these men before it reached me. It failed them because they did not have a title or a news cycle or an attorney who answered calls in the middle of the night. It failed them because the people inside the system had been allowed to operate without the kind of oversight that accountability requires. And that allowance was not an accident. It was a sustained institutional choice made over years with sustained costs that these four men paid from their own lives. He paused. He looked at Vance. Vance looked up. Their eyes met, and what passed between them in that meeting had no name for it exactly, but it was something conclusive. The last communication between two people at the end of a story that has finally arrived at its ending. Desmond said, "I did not come to this department for myself. I came for Wendell. I came for the men in the second row. I came for everyone who ever sat on that bench in that lobby and was made to feel like a problem to be managed rather than a citizen to be served. The law has a purpose. It is not to provide power to the people who enforce it. It is to protect the people who live under it." He stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat. Simone Rivers put her hand on his arm briefly. He acknowledged it with a slight inclination of his head and was still. Vance's statement lasted a short time. He had prepared something about dedication to service. 3 sentences in, Judge Marsh raised one hand, a small, flat gesture of interruption. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "the court has watched the video." She paused. "Your service record, as you would define it, is already in evidence. I would rather hear from the 4 people who experienced it directly than from the person who delivered it." The silence that followed was its own verdict. Vance sat down. Judge Marsh looked at him over her reading glasses for a long moment before speaking. The specific quality of her attention was such that every person in the room felt it, even though it was directed at one person. She had the patience of someone who has waited for the right moment to speak for many years and has learned that the moment always comes if you wait correctly. "The court has reviewed your personnel file," she said. "The court has watched the video in full, including the audio from the transport vehicle. The court has heard from the people you harmed. The court has heard from the officer who was present and chose at professional and personal cost to tell the truth about what he witnessed. The court has heard from the supervisor who spent years creating the conditions that made your conduct possible and who has given a full account of exactly how he did it." She removed her reading glasses. She set them on the bench in front of her. "There is nothing in any of that material that supports the characterization of your conduct as error, mistake, or lapse in judgment. The pattern is too consistent. The victims are too numerous. The mechanism of protection was too deliberate. You believed the law applied to other people. You were given repeated evidence that you were correct to believe this because the people responsible for correcting that belief chose instead to protect it." She picked up her pen. "Officer Vance Pruitt, on the count of felony assault under color of law, I sentence you to years in federal penitentiary. On the count of deprivation of civil rights, I sentence you to an additional consecutive term. Total incarceration, years. No possibility of parole for the first several. Your pension is stripped in its entirety. You are permanently barred from employment in law enforcement in any capacity, in any jurisdiction, for the remainder of your life." The gavel came down. The sound of it was the specific sound of finality, the same sound that had populated hundreds of Desmond's case files, the same sound he had walked away from many times after long and difficult work. The sound that means the record is closed and the next chapter begins. He sat with it for a moment. Let it complete. The marshals approached Vance. They moved him from the defense table and turned him toward the side door. As they did, Vance turned his head one final time over his shoulder, and his eyes found Desmond in the gallery. What was on Vance's face in that moment was not resentment and not hatred. The contempt that had structured his professional identity for some time was entirely gone, replaced by something much more defeated. The expression of a man who has finally encountered the actual weight of what he believed and found it heavier than he can carry. Desmond looked back at him with the same steadiness he had maintained since the lobby, since the bench, since the transport car, since the booking desk, and the dropped pen, and the moment the room understood what it was dealing with. He gave Vance one slow, deliberate nod, not triumphant, not pitying, simply acknowledged, concluded, done. Then he looked away. He looked at the 4 men in the second row. Quentin Briggs had his hands folded in his lap and his eyes straight ahead. Isaiah Stills was looking at his own hands. Lamar Maddox had his jaw set in a way that was the specific expression of a young man processing something large that has finally been given its proper weight. Derek Harlow was looking directly at Desmond, and when their eyes met, Harlow gave him a nod that was the same nod Desmond had just given Vance. Not triumphant, not simple, not anything that a single word can fully hold, but containing within it years of waiting, and the end of the waiting, and the beginning of something that might, with sustained effort, be called justice. The side door closed. Vance's cries disappeared behind it, muffled and then gone. The room exhaled. The work that followed was the actual work, as distinct from the dramatic sequence that had preceded it, and it proceeded with the steady, unglamorous momentum that institutional change requires. It was not swift. It was not clean. It was the process of reorienting an organization that had been operating on one set of premises toward a different set, which required understanding the old premises clearly enough to address them specifically, and the new ones clearly enough to articulate them consistently and in small daily decisions rather than in single dramatic declarations. The Civilian Oversight Board was constituted soon. 7 members, 2 retired judges, a retired public defender, a community health worker from the Ellison Street neighborhood, a professor of criminal justice from Hargrove University, and 2 ordinary residents selected through a civic lottery. Full subpoena authority, a direct reporting line to the city council that bypassed the police department entirely. Desmond attended the first board meeting as an invited observer, not as a presiding authority, because the point of the board was precisely that its oversight not be subject to his approval. The mandatory body camera policy went into effect soon after the announcement. A compliance audit sometime later found 0 unauthorized deactivations. Desmond reviewed the audit himself and filed it as the baseline against which every future audit would be measured. 3 of the prior complainants reached civil settlements with the city. The total was substantial, funded entirely by Desmond's express insistence through a legal mechanism his attorney identified, and the mayor's office successfully executed through the department's forfeited misconduct insurance reserve rather than from the general tax base. Not 1 cent from Hargrove's taxpayers to compensate for what Hargrove's department had done. The 4th prior complainant, Isaiah Stills, declined a financial settlement. He requested and received a formal written apology from the city on official letterhead, signed by the mayor, read into the public record at a city council meeting, and entered permanently into the municipal archive. He said in a brief public statement that he had been waiting longer for someone to acknowledge what had happened than he had been waiting for money, and that the acknowledgement was what he had needed. Officer Nolan Calloway received a formal commendation for his voluntary cooperation with the investigation. He was promoted to training officer on the department's newly developed ethics curriculum, a curriculum that Desmond had overseen personally and that included in its first module a discussion of the specific mechanics of institutional misconduct and the individual obligation to resist participation in it regardless of the professional cost. Calloway taught this module with the particular authority of someone who had lived the exam before he understood the material. Sometime after the lobby incident, the Hargrove City Police Department's civilian complaint rate for use of force was the lowest in the department's recorded history. The Community Trust Index, compiled quarterly through independent survey, was at its highest point since the metric was introduced years earlier. On a morning sometime later, Desmond Webb walked into the Hargrove City Police Department through the front entrance. He walked through the lobby at his ordinary pace. Not ceremonially, the bench near window 4 was there. Same bench, same placard above it. The placard he had read on the morning that had changed everything. He passed it in his peripheral vision and felt briefly, completely, the ghost of Wendell. Not the grief of Wendell, not the absence, but his presence. His laugh, the specific quality of his attention when he was in a room. The way he had loved this city for years and deserved to be loved back by it. Desmond felt this and let himself feel it and kept walking. The Howard University hoodie was returned to him after the trial concluded and the evidence log was formally closed. His attorney's paralegal brought it to his office in a clear evidence bag. Desmond held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its familiar weight, its worn softness, the fraying at the cuffs from years of wear. The stain from the spit was still there, faint on the left side above the Bison logo if you knew to look for it. Dry cleaning had reduced it but not eliminated it. He donated it to the city's newly established Police Accountability Documentation Center housed in a ground floor space in the Civic Center building, 3 blocks from the police department. It was framed behind glass in the center's main display area, mounted beside a white placard bearing a brief factual account of the incident in 5 names: Quentin Briggs, Lamar Maddox, Derek Harlow, Isaiah Stills, Desmond Ellington Webb. The center opened on a morning in early spring. Clear weather, sharp air. A small crowd gathered before the doors opened. Residents, advocates, journalists, a delegation from the city council, a minister from a church on 4th Street, who opened the proceedings with a brief prayer about the uses of memory and the responsibilities of institutions to the people they serve. The prior complainants arrived separately and found each other near the entrance and stood together in the loose ease of people who have been through something significant in proximity and have arrived through that experience at a form of mutual recognition that does not require explanation. They went inside together. They found the placard. They stood in front of it, and they were quiet, each in his own way. Quentin Briggs touched the glass with 2 fingers. Derek Harlow stood with his hands in his coat pockets, very still. Lamar Maddox nodded slowly in the manner of a young man processing something large that has finally been assigned its proper weight. Isaiah Stills read the placard twice, carefully both times. Then he turned and looked at the room, at the people who had come, at the space that had been built, at the fact of it existing. And his expression held grief and resolution in the particular proportion that comes from knowing that something deeply wrong has been acknowledged at last, even though acknowledgement cannot undo what was wrong. It is not the same as undoing, but it is not nothing. It is in its own way everything that can actually be done. Desmond Webb stood at the back of the room. He had declined the invitation to speak. There were people on the program who had been waiting longer for the chance to be heard in settings like this one, and the order of speaking should reflect that. He stood near the back wall and watched. A woman nearby, a resident he did not know in a green coat holding the program from the ceremony, glanced at him and then at the placard and then back at him. "Thank you," she said quietly, without performance, the way people say things when they mean them without wanting to make them larger than they are. Desmond looked at her. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "I want you to know that." She nodded. They stood together for a moment in the comfortable silence of 2 people looking at the same thing and understanding it. Then the ceremony continued around them, and Desmond stayed at the back and watched the 4 men at the placard and did not say anything more. The room was saying it without him. That was the point. That was, in the end, the whole point. Vance Pruitt is currently serving his sentence at a correctional facility in Central Ohio. He has no pension, no badge, and no future in law enforcement in any jurisdiction for the remainder of his life. The city of Hargrove settled the full civil liability for millions. Not 1 cent from the general tax base, every dollar recovered from the department's forfeited misconduct insurance reserve, a fund whose balance had been quietly inflated over time by the very settlements that Vance's prior conduct had already necessitated. Warren Moss served time for obstruction of justice, was released on schedule, and has not held public employment since. The union representative who told Vance, "We've handled worse than this," declined to comment for any subsequent reporting on the case. Desmond Ellington Webb completed his first full year as chief of police of Hargrove City with the lowest civilian use of force complaint rate in the department's recorded history and the highest community trust index since the metric was introduced years earlier. He keeps 2 things on his desk. One is a photograph of Wendell, not a formal portrait, a candid shot of Wendell laughing at something off camera with the full-body, completely unself-conscious laugh that was his most characteristic gift to any room he entered. The other is a photograph of the lobby bench empty on an ordinary morning. He has never explained the second photograph to anyone who has asked about it. He just says it reminds him of something important and gets back to work. The spit was meant to reduce a man, to make him feel the dimensions of powerlessness that Vance Pruitt had spent his time on the force manufacturing and deploying against people who had fewer institutional resources than he did. What it actually did was hand that man the exact evidence he needed in the exact setting where it could do the most work, in front of exactly the witnesses whose accounts would prove most decisive. Arrogance never fully accounts for the quality of attention in the people it is aimed at. Vance walked across a lobby toward a man sitting quietly on a bench, and he believed he knew exactly what he was walking toward. He had no idea. He never does. And that specific blindness, that specific failure to see the person actually in front of you, is both how it starts and how it ends. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel. More stories like this one every week.